Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, HR Program Improvement, Survey, Focus Groups, and Recommendation Strategy. Our presenter today is Mike D'Souza. Mike is a senior HR consultant with CPS HR Consulting. Before we begin, I'd like to go over just a few pieces of information about the webinar. To avoid interruptions to the presentation, all attendees are in listen-only mode. You can still ask questions, and we encourage you to do so using the Q&A box in the webinar dashboard. We will make every effort to address your questions at the end of the presentation as time allows. Today's presentation is available on the CPS HR Consulting website. We'll also forward a link to all of our attendees once today's recording is available for viewing. And now, without further ado, I'll turn the presentation over to Mike.
Thank you, Julie. Well, good morning or afternoon, depending on time zone, to everyone out there. Pleased to be with you today. I want to note from the outset that this presentation and the content is a co-production of myself and my colleague, Jeff Hoy, who worked on it together, but Jeff has to be traveling this week, so is not available to join us today in the webinar. We know there are lots of HR departments today that know how they're performing with their customers, but we also know that there's some that probably don't have that same awareness. We're going to be sharing some ways that we have the opportunity to work with HR departments to help them measure performance. It takes some guts to basically be an HR leader to ask for feedback, and we'll spend some time talking about that today, but we think we're going to offer some powerful methods and techniques to focus on the products and services that you offer and get feedback on that today. Let's take a look at our agenda. We believe that HR matters, that HR department services make a big difference in overall organizational performance, no matter what kind of sector your public agency works in. We know that when you look at the opportunity to go measure performance, to take a look at how you are delivering your services and how effectively those are being received, you have options, you have choices. We're going to talk specifically about an approach and option, not to the exclusion of others, but one that we've certainly had some success with working with clients. So we'll be talking particularly on an approach to assessment that we've had quite a bit of experience working with a lot of different public agencies and share some lessons learned in that. We'll be looking at some real HR service assessment results with, of course, names changed to protect the innocent, particularly to respect our clients' privacy, but we have some, I think, very positive results to share as well. And we're talking about kind of fundamentally the starting point of accepting and using feedback that requires some kind of deep and important choices on the part of HR to decide how it is going to orient itself to customer feedback. And talk about the resulting power of basically of measuring performance, taking action when you realize there's some gap areas, and then remeasuring after you implement changes to see to understand your level of success. And we understand that we'll say multiple times today, there's some different orientations to kind of feedback, and there are things that get in the way of successful feedback. One of them is sometimes thought to be the notion of kind of retribution or concern, that if I give some kind of negative feedback, that's going to hurt me in my relationship. We find sometimes just the opposite is true, that customers sometimes can be reluctant to give frank and open feedback because they appreciate how hard HR is working and how much they're trying to get certain things done, and they don't want to give them bad news. So we have to make it a little bit easier for customers to give that very useful feedback. Fundamentally, our kind of starting point for today is really a vision that the human system, which we call the talent management system, is really the foundation of any kind of performance transformation. We believe that the talent management system is really that kind of connection of products and services that you as HR are offering, the attraction of talent, the developing of talent, the leveraging and retaining talent. The catalyst, kind of the spark here, is really the potential to have a set of performance metrics or measurements that will tell you what to keep doing because your client really your client or customer really likes it, it really works for them. It'll also tell you where to leverage your constrained resources. You know, HR has a lot of pressure put on it today, and to be quite honest, it can't do everything at every moment, at every time. So our focus today is helping to better identify the more focused, limited areas that will provide the most bang for the buck in HR services delivery. We often kind of speak in terms of the talent management system, which you see in the diagram in front of you, and the vital importance of having the different pieces of it to be aligned, to have them working together or moving in the same direction. We find sometimes it's too common, the different pieces of kind of HR practice, they're not aligned. Basically, the recruiting focus is for skills A and B. But on the other hand, the training focus seems to be for skills C and D. And then finally, the reward systems within the organization are focusing on skills E and F. It's real difficult to be successful unless the different pieces of the system are not working in support of each other and in alignment. Well, this graphic is from Deloitte, the consulting firm, a little graphic, and it really wants to emphasize the idea that, yeah, there's a lot of pressure on HR these days. There's a lot of pressure in terms of service delivery with our customers, and the fact that, as you see in this graphic, that in most cases our customers are not exactly valuing what we're doing at the same level of scale that we want them to. Wouldn't it be nice to know, when we're dealing with maybe some customer disappointment, what's the so-called 80-20 here? You know, what are the limited number of factors to focus on to get a bigger performance boost? Because in most cases, and we'll show in some of our slides today some samples of assessment activity that basically, in most cases, especially in an initial assessment, the customers will almost always have a lower rating or a lower favorability of the delivery of HR services than HR does. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. Well, so what does public leadership want from HR? Well, the good news or the bad news is they seem to want just about everything. There's tremendous demands being put on HR these days, with especially an emphasis on newness, on innovation. Innovation in ways that we use technology and apply it, innovation in faster ways to assess skills development and have those skills imparted, innovation in our training learning processes to get people skilled up so they can be contributing, and fundamentally innovation in the engagement and leveraging of the most diverse workforce in basically our history. Well, what's the key when we have all these demands on us? What are the keys to innovation? One of the keys could be, as Peter Drucker, the great management guru for many decades, said, you tend to manage what you measure, and that's going to be our focus of our assessment discussion today. Well, but you have choices when you think about measuring HR service delivery. You have the proverbial noise or silence model. Well, if they aren't complaining, things must be okay, right? No news is good news. Well, most of us know, as we've experienced kind of the value of feedback, that probably isn't as useful of a measure. You have HR management by walking around. This is a play on the management by walking around notion that really came into business from the founders of the Hewlett-Packard Company, who were the first to basically say that if you're in leadership, you need to leave your office and wander around the organization to understand what's going on, and certainly that can have some value. You can measure service delivery at simply a transaction level. You can kind of count, well, how many training sessions and how many recruiting fairs and how many employer relations discussions are we conducting? That is a starting point. But we also can go a bit deeper. You know, we can start to have other communication activities such as interviews, focus groups. We can benchmark practices against other organizations, and we can consider using polls and surveys, which is going to be one of our focuses today. Well, why surveys or polls? What's so great about those particularly? Well, our experience has been that one of the big pluses is this can be a greater consistency of method, where you have greater kind of continuity of inquiry, because the survey content is something that is determined and frozen, as opposed to the variance of how different interviewers or focus group leaders might approach getting information from people. A survey is a particularly time and cost efficient model these days, especially as we for many of us have transitioned from the world of paper survey activity and compilation to online tools, whether from the relatively easy and free tools to more sophisticated online survey technology. And the fact that you have a potential with a survey or a poll tool to have, of course, quantitative feedback, which is often, we call it scaled, where it lends itself to quantitative discussion and numerical values. But you can also use it to gather certain amounts of qualitative kind of experiential information. And fundamentally, what we think surveys allow you to do is to move past the how of customer satisfaction or dissatisfaction, kind of that initial sense that people are kind of happy or kind of not happy about something, and start to understand the whys that underpin that situation, because the answer to the why is going to be the focus that we're going to need to have to make a difference and make our customers happier. Now, in some of our work with organizations, HR departments, and many public agencies, we've found that some things seem to be particularly important. The first is the idea that when you're surveying something, you're not just surveying HR in general. You're going to have a focus on what we call functional areas. And functional areas tend to be, depending on how you're organized on an org chart, the major service components of HR. So in many organizations, those are employment and selection, and or training and development, and or class and comp, and or employer relations, and also potentially records and benefits, and payroll and leaves, if that's a function within HR. So we're going to be measuring not just HR in general, but looking in greater detail. We're drilling down to the different service functions. And we're also applying a concept of service criteria, and in a coming slide, we'll get into more detail. The idea that we're not just looking to measure how happy or unhappy you are, but to understand the why. And we have found, not that this is the only service criteria that is useful, but we've used it a lot working with clients and found it to be rather successful. Service criteria such as efficiency, consistency, the quality of the product, the customer service experience and relationship, the partnership between the receiver of the service and HR, and finally the follow-up concept. And we've had some success using the rating scale that is different from the standard levels of satisfaction to basically the frequency in which the service is meeting customer expectations, from routinely does not meet to routinely exceeds a 5 scale. Although you'll see some examples in some of the slides today where, based on customer preference, sometimes they have a preference for a slightly different scale than the 5 scale exemplified here. Our approach really in a lot of the measurement of services is kind of consistent to the concept I know a lot of HR folks out there are familiar with, how competencies work. The competencies are statements about how we want work done in a workplace, but they're kind of meaningless unless you have underneath that a more detailed understanding. So if you had a requirement in a workplace of a skill to have good meetings, that in and of itself doesn't give very much direction about, well, how do I know if someone is actually having good meetings? Whereas if you have in competencies, they call them behavioral indicators or behavioral anchors. You have specific examples of action or behavior that'll tell you if someone is exhibiting the competency. So for meetings, we might say, is there a published agenda before the meeting that is a written plan of what we're trying to accomplish? Will there be methods practiced in the meeting that ensure people have the chance for full and fair participation in the meeting? Do we have an agreement on our methodology of how we're going to make decisions? Are we going to vote? Are we going to raise hands? Is it going to be something else? And then finally, do we have a capture of responsibilities and action items in the meeting so that something gets done between this meeting and the next meeting. So the point being, you've got to have something underneath competencies to make it work that similarly works in our assessment approach today. And to elaborate the service criteria, and again, not saying that this is the be-all and the end-all of methodology, but what we found, what we mean is for service efficiency for us means speed, cycle time. Cycle time is basically the actual time it takes to complete an action. What you may have found in some of your work, and we see it all the time, is cycle time includes time in which something isn't moving when it's waiting and sitting. And sometimes you'll do research and find out, well, how long does it take to process a expense report? And somebody will say 3 days. What you find when you examine cycle time is for almost all that time period, the expense report is sitting in an inbox somewhere. It isn't being acted on. It's exhibiting what they call waste in the lean methodology. It's not moving. But efficiency is a standard. And certainly in a lot of areas, especially recruitment and retention, speed and efficiency is a really important criteria that customers are asking for. Next, I want to talk about consistency. Nothing gets clients upset than the fact that they go to HR or they go to an analyst and ask, well, what's the policy or the practice on doing X or Y, and they get an answer. And they come back the next day and they talk to somebody else. What's the policy or practice on the same thing? And they get a different answer. That causes confusion. So consistency can be the application of consistent with policy or procedure or certain other standards, sometimes organizational mission or vision. And finally, quality. And quality can be better defined, just like competencies, as the notion of completeness and accuracy, professional, and the idea that there isn't a lot of rework. You don't have to keep sending the same darn form back and forth to finally be completed because it's done right the first time. And then customer service, which we define working with customers often as the respectful treatment of the customer. That you may be meeting efficiency and consistency and quality, but at the point when you deliver something to the customer, if it's kind of with a grunt and a sneer, that isn't exactly a respectful treatment of the service receiver. And then the notion of fundamentally partnership. This is the idea that HR and service delivery needs to think about, am I doing a good job educating my customer as to their roles and responsibilities in this service delivery? Sometimes the reason why the customer doesn't do something right is because we're very expert in it and we already know what needs to be happening. We didn't take time to explain to them their role of responsibility in responding to the form or their role of responsibility in the oral panels. As a result, they don't do as good a job as we would like, and we end up with kind of a poor result because we haven't enforced the partnership standard. And then finally, follow-up. Follow-up is simply, there's often significant wait periods while a client or customer is waiting for something to happen that HR is working on. Most customers really appreciate a periodic check-in just to know, gee, I checked with that other office that is a stakeholder in this process, and they haven't signed off on it yet. I'm going to recheck with them later in the week. That notion of not having long periods of silence between the initiation of a service and the ultimate delivery is really helpful. So we find these service criteria tend to be useful and tend to matter a lot to customers. Okay, we'll have a couple polls during the webinar just to get some interest and background from y'all. The first would be, the question is basically, in the last couple of years, has your HR organization undertaken some type of assessment of its service delivery to customers and clients? So we want to see what's going out there in your experience.
Okay, answers are coming in pretty quickly. You can select only one answer, of course. And we'll give this maybe another 5 seconds for responses to come in. So please enter your response and we will share those responses in just a moment. And okay, looks like we've got them all. So we'll close the poll and share the results. Okay. Mike, do we have any surprises?
Not particularly. We have actually almost a third is pretty much yes. That's interesting. No, 51%, and that's not a negative to the organization, and some folks don't know particularly. What we find when we get contacted to maybe work with someone on some type of assessment activity, we make certain assumptions about why that is so, and we're not perfect, but we're right a fair amount of the time. Sometimes the reason that someone is contacting us about working with them on assessment is, well, something bad has been happening, at least from the standpoint of some level of leadership. Or it is the case where you have relatively new leadership perhaps in a city or county organization, new leadership in HR. We find this a bit more positive situation where a new leader wants to get a stronger handle on the status quo of our service work with our customers and clients. What we would find in general is, and when we are contacted and the situation seems to be that things are going pretty well in this HR organization, in this public agency, but they aspire to even better. That gets us really excited. I mean, I would say that is a little less common, but that's consistent with, if you're familiar as a parent, that's the well baby physical. That's the idea of the baby's not sick yet, but we're still doing something good just to make sure that it continues to be well. But whether the situation is reactive or proactive, we're finding more and more interest in HR assessment activity.
Okay, are we ready to move on to the slide deck again? Okay, on to the next slide.
Now, our typical kind of survey assessment HR process tends to look like the following. We work with both HR and its customers in the design and development of the survey tool itself. And basically, results get published and get shared, of course, and the results are quantitative and or qualitative. Then we typically would recommend, and this is not a requirement, but we think it has tremendous value, that focus groups with HR customers, when they're presented with results, and we work with them in a group setting to understand what's the story behind the numbers, both positive and negative, that is favorable and less favorable. You want to know where there's areas of especially high customer dissatisfaction, what's the reason for that? The survey will tell you a significant part of that, but there's a lot of value to be gained from a focus group, not with all customers, but usually with a sampling of customers. But equally important to understand the points of light, the areas of excellence that are going on as well. When things are going especially well, especially in certain functional areas, that maybe employer relations is getting just fantastic marks coming back from the customers, you want to know why. What is employer relations doing perhaps different than recruitment and selection is doing in the customer relationship? And then phase 3 is basically HR receiving the results of the survey itself, and the focus group feedback takes a look and says, okay, what are the major priority activities and what should be our response to them? And HR is not just using their own creativity and thoughtfulness, but because we have garnered from the focus groups as well, not just what's the story behind the numbers, but what the customers think are the things that would matter most to close the gap to make the improvement and consider the customer input. And then phase 4, of course, is basically acting on the results, which is always the most critical part, sometimes the most difficult part. We usually recommend treating the response to an HR survey services assessment just like you do any kind of a project, where you have a project plan and a schedule. You assign resources. You have particular milestones you want to meet to know that you're making progress. You have tracking and reporting. And for goodness sake, you're sharing back with the organization, both customers and HR, relative progress, towards those things. When the numbers start getting better, when the kudos start coming back, you're sharing that with the organization. And then finally, as in any type of assessment activity, you're committing to remeasure at a future point. and not just that you remeasured, but that you're publicizing the results of the remeasure as well. Sometimes organizations will do assessment activity. They'll take it to heart. They'll work hard to basically try to make some improvements in certain areas, but they don't. They hold their light under a bushel, so to speak. That they don't share that activity with the organization as wisely as they should, and they don't get the credit from the organization. I like to say that good things don't happen in organizations because the elves come out at night and do all the work for everybody. It comes from committed people, committed HR organizations. We want to make sure they get the recognition for that. Okay, now we're going to look at some sample kind of scoring activities from some actual projects we work with clients on, and we'll proceed from kind of the notion of kind of overall measure, and then we'll continue kind of drilling down to finer points of analysis here, and we hope you find that kind of interesting. And the first example we'll see is it's not particularly a negative or unfavorable result. It's one that if you got it as a first assessment, you'd say, okay, no, not so bad. We didn't get particularly slammed here. And we're looking at this example here. Overall, you see, and I'll call your attention really to the two pie charts on the right part of the screen where you see HR staff ratings and client ratings. It's very important in this approach that the input is not just from customers, but also from HR themselves. And we want to make a distinction in just a second on that, but to say that it's very important to kind of know the starting point of how does HR feel about what it's attempting to do in service delivery. Does HR think they're doing fantastic, or does HR think they're not doing so well? It's not surprising that in many cases, HR and the customer are often fairly aligned. Even when the customer is sometimes very kind of critical of HR, you'll find out that HR itself has an awareness of that, and we would argue that's a very positive situation. You see in this kind of example in the two smaller pie charts as percentage comparisons that the rating feedback where it's meeting expectations was about 58% for HR, about 47% for the client. Sometimes exceeding was 8.9% for HR and 10.2% for the client. And then the last kind of bucket of not meeting expectation, which of course is the less favorable one, about half a percent of HR and a little over 7% for the client. So we would say this illustrates the point that usually HR does have a little different kind of self-estimation. That's okay. But it's an important starting point. You see in this example that otherwise the results are fairly aligned. There's not a huge kind of chasm of differences here, and it's a decent starting point. The reason why the customer pie chart is repeated on the left side of the slide is to kind of to make the point, as important as HR self-estimation is, the customer evaluation matters most. It's all well and good that you think you're doing something in a certain way, but fundamentally your customer's opinion, should basically take the higher position, and that's why it's represented that way. Let's look at another example of some real results here. This is a survey that used a slightly different scale. It wasn't a 5-point scale, but it was a simple 3 scale. Some of you are familiar with this since versions of this are used in some types of performance management and some public agencies where it's really exceeds client needs, meets client needs, and does not meet client needs in this different example. This was an example of a first assessment survey in a large state agency, and you see basically, again, the example that the does not meet percentage is a bit higher, for the client. That's not unusual. Interestingly, the exceeds rating measurements in the survey were almost pretty much identical here. 24% of the client ratings is being a does not meet standard. Right, another example. When you're looking at what is ultimately the survey assessment feedback, you have to make a choice about how to react to the feedback. It can be a fairly human frailty to basically find some reason to not want to accept the feedback, to even attempt to reject it a little bit. We can, especially when we get less favorable news, we get news where we're being, attacked a bit or slammed a bit. We feel things like, well, they just don't like us. We have a tough job to do, and we're not as appreciated. The client particularly doesn't want us to succeed. We're trying to hold them to certain requirements and regulations and standards, and they don't like that interference. So again, they don't feel so good about us. They feel they don't need us. In many cases, they just want to be set to do whatever they darn well want to do, and not understand that HR practices, often are intertwined with a lot of regulatory and legal dimensions, where certain things have to be done certain ways because that is the law and or that is the organizational standard. That basically the clients themselves can be seen as part of the problem. Now, as folks who work in HR a lot, and as folks who come from HR organizations, we understand that yes, sometimes customers are challenging to work with. Sometimes they may complicate the difficulty of a situation, but there are fundamental reasons for being, and that's a really important starting point. A little different approach might be to take a look at survey results and the feedback from a little different perspective. And I'd like to preface this with a little example from my own kind of work history and a orientation to feedback that is a little different than the one that a lot of us perhaps were raised and educated towards. Some years ago, earlier in my career, I worked for a U.S. subsidiary of a Japanese technology company. And at our work site, which was in California, we had a significant number of expatriate Japanese engineers and managers in the organization, and it was a very interesting opportunity. And it's after hours one day at work, and we're in an open cubicle system, so you can hear what's going on anywhere. And one of the Japanese engineers is meeting with the Japanese engineering manager, and even though I don't speak Japanese beyond what I call restaurant Japanese, you can figure out that somebody is getting chewed out. And you watch the exchange going on, over there, and it looks, kind of unpleasant and whatever. And eventually the engineer gets up and walks over to our area, and we greet him, and I'll make up a name and say, well, gee, boy, Shoji, that was kind of a tough conversation you were having with your boss over there. And instead of him, kind of holding his head down and maybe feeling bad about it, his reaction was just the opposite of what we anticipated. He said, basically, in our kind of business culture, where I come from, for the manager to be very critical of me is an indication of his belief in my potential, my ability to do better. And it's just the opposite. It's ultimately a compliment. To receive that critical feedback is a sign that he believes I really could do a lot better, and him wanting to encourage me to do that. But the opposite would be true in this business culture. But if you're not getting any critical feedback, any constructive feedback, it's a sign not that you're perfect, but that someone has given up on you in terms of your potential. So again, and not arguing that we can take this model and apply it 100% to our work in business environments, but the notion that when someone gives you feedback, part of the story is their belief that you might actually use the feedback. It is an indication of a certain amount of faith and trust that you're going to use it, and that is a compliment. And also acceptance includes the notion that if we're focusing on limited areas to improve, the so-called 80-20 rule, we're looking for the few things that matter most, the things that I can do that give the most bang for the buck, that will help in the improvement of the service delivery and really tell us what's most important. Okay, we continue our kind of modeling and showing how some results come down from this type of assessment activity. We're going to look at results from for HR functional areas in a particular survey. And again, this is moving from HR overall to start to understand, are there differences in the relative levels of happiness with service delivery in different subparts of HR services. Now, this happens to be, again, this is a survey that has a so-called 5-point scale where 3.0 is meeting needs. So when you're dealing with a scale of that sort, ratings below 3.0 are especially concerning because you're not even meeting basic needs. You see that the overall HR staff average on the bars on the right was a little higher than client, which is not a client, while employer relations receives the lowest average rating from both HR and the client. So it starts to give us a sense that if we're going to focus on improvement activities, not that we can't do that widely as well, but we may want to, as a starting point, be drilling down even deeper into employer relations. And as you'll see in a coming slide, we're going to continue in the drill down to take a look at particular work activities going on within employer relations to see if we can pinpoint the need areas even further. And we find that this kind of drill down process, both in the survey tool itself and again in those focus groups that follow to get additional customer feedback, this starts to provide us with that focus that we've been talking about. We said at the get-go that a lot is expected of HR. HR is expected to do almost everything that the organization wants, but HR, like any service organization, has limited resources, limited time, limited focus, and our emphasis today is that we want to be spending most of our time doing the smaller number of things that matter most to the customer, because that's where the need is, but also that success will buy us the kind of time and cooperation that allows us to kind of move on to even the next level of need. So here you see, these are a breakdown of kind of service areas within employer relations. The example from other kind of survey research is when you do, for example, an employee survey on training topics, and you get that feedback where people basically say, well, we're not happy about that. You still don't know yet, where the need is. So for here, you wouldn't know, for example, is this finding because of lack of adequate training on performance management forms and processes? Is it consistency or inconsistency of the HR review of appraisals, which happens in a lot of organizations? Is it the relative turnaround time of getting appraisals reviewed by HR and back to the appointing departments? Do the forms used in performance appraisal, they don't really work well, they don't provide meaningful feedback? Or is there a lack of follow-up on special cases? We're still going to want to know, even in this area of a little greater need, is where there's a little bigger gap of what are the particular things that are going to matter most. The purpose of this slide, which has a lot going on to it, and I want to focus this on a particular aspect of it, and this is really the principle of, so you're going to give the survey to your customers, you're going to give the survey to your clients, but how do you know that you have informed and knowledgeable raters doing the rating in the process? Because this survey in both pie charts basically, before the person gets a chance to rate, it asks them if they, in a lot of our surveys, the question is posed as, have you had direct knowledge of this service? And often it's within a recent time period, 3 months, 6 months, something of that sort. When the person says no, the survey can be designed such that they do not go on to rate that area, because if the belief is that I want input from people who have significant knowledge on this service delivery, I may want to exclude folks who do not. You see in this example where HR itself, 3/4 of HR, had some particular knowledge on the learning and development kind of functionality, so they could go on to rate. On the customer side, only a little more than a third had direct knowledge on that, and those folks did go on to rate. So the point being, you have some feedback here, but because some folks don't have direct knowledge, you may want to take some of that data with a little bit of a grain of salt or a consideration. It also means you may need to promote people's better understanding of what those services actually are. So if you want to only have knowledgeable raters be your raters, you have two choices. You either, in the issuance of the survey, decide on the sub-audiences who will receive that. Sometimes that's organizational. You pick folks in a certain level and above in the organization who would more likely have that experience and make sure the survey goes to them as opposed to everyone. Or you can, as the example I gave, the survey can be designed such that if in every section you have a test question, do you have direct recent knowledge with this HR service area? If it's yes, the survey takes them on to rate. If the answer is no, they zip ahead to the next category. Those are choices you have. Neither one is the absolute right answer in all cases, but you do have options. Okay, we're going to come on to our second and final poll today. What we'd like to know is your sense of, in your public agency, how would HR's customers and clients react to the opportunity of an HR assessment of the sort that we're talking about today? How would they feel if they were told, oh, this is coming down the pipeline?
Okay, and for this one, you can select all of the answers that apply. You're not restricted to just one response. And we're seeing a clear leader on this one so far. Still early results, though. We'll give it about another 10 seconds, so please get your responses in. And okay, we've got another one catching up, but our initial leader is still the leader. Okay. Okay. Looks like we've just about got all of our answers here. So we'll close this poll and share the results. And there we go. Okay. So.
Well, I think the good news is a very kind of strong response on welcoming to the assessment. The second choice would participate with some maybe lower expectations, decent response as well. Waste of time, not a big number. I think that's hopeful too. The second from the bottom would be reluctant to give direct, honest feedback identifies a really important point. It is a very significant activity to secure the cooperation of feedback givers, to have them understand, one, there's no risk in doing that, but also to give them a higher expectation that we're going to use your information to make your life and work better. Therefore, your self-interest will be involved. And we want to be involved. Maybe not as strong there because we haven't talked about that aspect of it. But as we said several slides ago, that part of the formation of the survey tool is usually not to involve just HR, of course, but to involve some selected customer groups to have input to the formation of the instrument. So good news here.
Okay, terrific. So let's close this up and go back to our slide deck.
We mentioned earlier that the surveys and polls don't just give you so-called scaled or quantitative data, but they also give you the potential for other types of information. And there's some reasons why that probably can and should matter to have some types of written responses. The first and foremost reason is the safety valve function, that even the best designed survey cannot anticipate all areas of interest of all customers, and the fact that a shorter survey is more prone to get response than one that goes on too long. So safety valve function is to have at least some limited open-ended question content. This as well as drill down and as well as focus groups helps to explain the whys of some of the ratings in the surveys when we read through the sentences and the phrases that people provide us, and provides additional direction or drill down. There's a couple of different ways that we can give the open-ended feedback when it comes back to the customer. It can be either perfectly raw, unedited, untouched information, with one exception, which I'll speak to in just a second, versus what we call clustering of the responses. Leadership sometimes requests this. Raw responses is we give you all of the words of the customer. The only exception, we'll say in a second, tends to be redaction of accidental self-identification, and it's usually accidental, where the writer will say, as a 12-year supervisor in Department X who is left-handed and plays softball, I think the following. Well, they just identified, Joe Garcia in a particular, work unit. Well, we would someone would redact that part. So the pluses of the raw content, this is the VOC, the voice of the customer, the pure, unadulterated feedback. It has a lot of power. It's validating for responders, especially if, as part of the recording of results, you do share some or versions of the open-ended content. They see the real words being shared with, especially leadership, and they feel that they're being heard. It's also an opportunity not just to be unfavorable, but to do shout outs and to recognize in a verbal form some great service experiences. We already said on the minus side that it requires a little extra time to do a little redaction in case there is self-identification. Yes, you can still have the second bullet there. You can have some unconstructive kind of negative verbal feedback. You can't totally control that. And it can be hard in really large surveys with a lot of open-ended comment, a lot of verbal comment. It's sometimes a little harder to figure out how to put that into patterns, but that can be handled, as we'll say in the next slide. And we'll look at some samples, and these are just very, I would say typical in the sense that they're not negative, they're not particularly unconstructive. These are examples of responses to a rather general question of, do you have any other feedback you'd like to provide in a particular area? And these have not been particularly edited. Things like, the complaint is services are not forward-thinking and proactive. They're doing the same thing without change. Paperwork gets lost in the black hole. How often have we heard that in HR, and it makes us kind of feel bad? As you said earlier, we can either use that information to do something or just feel bad, and the former is probably more productive. HR promises to get something done, and they don't get it done, and or they don't let us know the status of it. These are common complaints, but certainly very important ones, and then things slip through the cracks here. I said earlier that there's another way besides just giving people piles and piles of sentences to basically summarize open-ended comments in an HR assessment. It often aligns with or corroborates the scaled numbers. You can have a team designated to go through all the written responses and to sort them into thematic piles of some sort. You see an example on the slide here. Leadership, especially senior leadership that is very busy with a lot of reports and written content, sometimes request this type of response because they sometimes don't have the time to, in very large surveys, to read hundreds of pages of written content. They'd like at least something in addition that summarizes the key messages from that, and this can provide that. Okay, reviewing and using the survey content. Your challenge in HR is to separate kind of the short-term kind of bad feeling of especially less favorable customer feedback from the opportunity for long-term growth. Another thing that HR can do is really positive in especially its organizational leadership role is to model performance improvement for the rest of the agency. What we're talking about today in terms of focusing on the few things that matter most to the customer is a model that can continue on to many other public agency departments outside of HR. And of course, sharing your improvement both within and outside. The reinforcement of improvement and change is fundamental. And the commitment to, over time, remeasure, improve, and measure again. The last couple slides here, I just want to show you this is an example. This is an example of a client we worked with a few years ago, and this is an overall, but this just shows change and improvement, where on their scale, 2.0 is meets expectations, so you don't want to be below that particularly. In their first survey, you see here where, interestingly, both HR and the customer thought, no, we're not cutting the mustard too well here. We're not doing as well as we'd like to do, and certainly the client believes that too. They basically went through a process similar to what we're talking about today in terms of survey assessment, focus group follow-up, action plan, implementation, and then about, about 15 months later did a resurvey. Again, this is the overall that shows, again, for both the customer area and the client area, you see a 31% increase of rating level for HR and a 22% increase overall rating for client responses here, showing that, and certainly this is the kind of thing that really helps an organization, allows HR to show that it is taking and using feedback to basically make improvements. And this buys HR the kind of cuts them some slack. It buys them the time to continue, in this process, because they're proving that they are using the feedback and it is making a difference to the organization. Last comment here is that a lot of us have heard of the 80-20 rule or the so-called Pareto principle. Just wanted you to know it comes from a real person. It's a 19th century economist. But when we talk about this, we're talking about the 80-20 rule, or the so-called the law of the vital few. It's helping to separate the noisy many things from the small number of most important things. And when applied to HR, this can give us the kind of defense that basically we need to be working on a smaller number of initiatives and changes that are going to make the most difference for our customers. And that is a perfectly legitimate and noble approach. I want to thank you for your time today and for your willingness to kind of consider the kind of guts and courage it takes to act to improve. You're to be commended for that. I want to note for my colleague Jeff Hoyer, who couldn't be here today, that some aspects of this topic will be in a presentation that some folks, actually a client and a CPS person, will be presenting at IPM HR. Now we'd like to turn to some questions on the chat line here.
Okay, so please enter your questions into the Q&A panel. And so shall we start with first?
Yeah, one of the first questions is, how do you decide if an HR department is really ready to do this? Excellent question. The first would be the relative willingness from the get-go to share results widely in the organization. If an organization is basically saying, and this does sometimes happen, well, I'm not going to commit to sharing results of this with the organization widely and my senior leadership. I'm going to wait and see what my results are. If I get a B- or higher, I'm going to share. If I'm not, I'm not. So I would argue that if you're not willing to share results, you're not ready yet. You need to work to get ready. And if you're not willing to make the resource commitment to the follow-up activity, which we spoke of, like project management, where you have to have an implementation plan, you have to have specific actions and measurement tracking. If you're not ready yet in any survey situation, we would usually say, then don't survey yet, get ready, and then survey. Another question, does the survey normally go to all non-HR employees? Not necessarily. We said earlier that you could decide, depending on the focus areas that you want to have, that the survey would not go to all non-HR customers. If you're assessing particular service areas that most employees wouldn't have knowledge of, you can either use that. I spoke of the survey technique, where the survey will skip someone through an area they don't know about to areas they do know about. You can use that, or more selectively send the survey to the positions or classifications who would tend to have the most direct knowledge of the HR services. But again, that's part of your planning process, working with your clients and customers so they're involved in that decision of sending it to everyone, or in some cases, not. Next question, how do you, in quotes, how do you encourage HR to really act on results instead of getting sidetracked by firefighting and all the demands that HR has? One way has been to tie certain parts of the action plan to the performance management process for HR staff and HR leadership. You make some of the objective activities specific goals within a time period that someone has to achieve, and because that gets measured and that counts in someone's career progression, it tends to make it more important, and it actually does tend to get acted on, as opposed to the good intention of wanting to act on the survey results. Okay. I'll ask Julie for the next question coming down the wire.
I see more questions. Here's one that asks, Should HR be making an annual assessment on their services and delivery? Or what frequency would you suggest?
That frequency is not uncommon. I would say anywhere between 1 to 2 year cycle. It really depends on the findings of the initial survey. Certainly, you can resurvey too darn soon. That would be the biggest error. To do it when there hasn't been an allowance of time to actually implement actions and have the customers understand of the relative improvements. So any less than 6 months, I'd be really nervous about. Certainly, in the range of 1 year to 18 months is a very common cycle to keep to. And if and when you act well and successfully based on the first survey, your relative response rate is going to continue to be strong in the following resurveys because people know that you're actually using the information to make a difference. The counter is also true. If you don't do a good job acting on the first survey results, to come back a year or two later and say they want to survey again, you're going to have a heck of a time getting cooperation and response because people are saying, well, you didn't use what we gave you the first time. Why should I bother with this again?
Great. So then this next question seems like a really good follow-up to that one, and that is, what are different ways to share successes prior to resurveying?
Certainly, there's a lot of different ways to share successes. Some HR organizations have some communication tools and newsletters and website, and they have certain ways that they get information out to the organization using those, as well as making sure that HR leadership in its leadership role and leadership communication is sharing that information up the organization to executive and senior leadership and reporting in management settings some of those things. But yeah, it's extremely important to let the organization know not just that you're taking action, but that you're getting results that gratifies the feedback givers, and that especially gratifies HR, who is doing the hard work of the change, and this gives them the energy to continue, trudging up the difficult road of relative improvement.
Terrific. I think we have time for one more question, and that is, what special considerations should HR teams consider? Should HR teams consider when an administration change occurs in the midst of a significant change initiative, such as an initiative designed to improve customer service?
Really good question. I would say a little bit tough not knowing some context of the question, except I think it's always from the get-go making sure that when there's been a change of administration, that new leadership understands their enlightened self-interest in that project initiative and or process. So if they haven't been party to that, I think there has to be a briefing or some type of educational process as soon as possible. Again, taking the understanding of a management perspective on something is why does this matter? Not HR's need, but why this is in the enlightened self-interest of the leadership to continue this, and making sure that they continue to be a stakeholder and an involved party in your ongoing process.
Well, thank you. We are at time now, so I want to thank you, Mike, for a great presentation, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. Again, we will send a follow-up email that will have a link to today's recording and to the slide deck from today's presentation. Thanks again. Have a great day.